And welcome. We'll start off with our bracha. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
So this week's parsha is Parsha Tetzaveh, and Parsha Tetzaveh essentially gets divided into two main sections. The first section has to do with the vestments of the high priest, and then subsequently the vestments of the regular priests, which are far less complicated. And also the second part, the second main part of Tetzaveh, deals with the inauguration of Aaron and his sons into the priesthood. And we are actually at this point where there are specific offerings that are brought by way of inducting Aaron and his sons into the priesthood. And they take place over the course of 7 days, as we have or will see. And then we get to next week's Parsha, which is Shmini, which means the eighth, which represents the eighth day of this process. So we have the construction of the tabernacle, we have the necessary vestments of the high priest, etc., and now we have the actual induction of those priests into the priesthood and into the operation of the sanctuary, in this case, the Mishkan, the tabernacle, the portable sanctuary that the Israelites had built in the course of their journeys through the journey through the Sinai wilderness and then ultimately into the land of Canaan. I was reading, there's a wonderful commentator by the name of Malbim. I believe he is 19th century, and he has some amazing interpretations, probably based on mystical interpretations of the Mishkan and this whole system. And to understand that there was symbolism in almost every little detail involved in the Mishkan, and in terms of the idea of the Mishkan representing as a body the Jewish people and also the individual. We've talked about that before, how the various parts of the Mishkan can be compared to a human body. I won't review that now, but what I read that I found so fascinating was that while the Mishkan represents the body, the work of the priests and the worship of the individuals there represents the soul. That if the physical body is the Mishkan, the actual worship taking place there is the actual consciousness on the part of human beings. And again, I believe this is all a way of trying to look into what significance we have as human beings in our relationship to the universe and to the creator of the universe. So going on now specifically with these are the offerings that we were talking about here. So ve'et el hamiluim, right here, right? Let's see if I can find my cursor, right? The ram of inauguration. Tikach, you shall take. Uvishalta et basaro. So this is after it has in fact been slaughtered and properly divided up, filleted, whatever. Uvishalta et basaro, and you shall cook its flesh, b'makom kadosh, in a holy area, in a holy precinct. And this is Rashi here. What do we mean by holy precinct? B'makom kadosh, v'chatzar ohel moed. So he says what that means is the actual enclosure, the courtyard of the tent of meeting. So without necessarily getting pictures, etc., we have the tent of meeting, which is the central structure, and then surrounding it, actually an area of 50 by 100 cubits, which would make it 75 by 150 feet approximately. There were curtains that surrounded this area, and that is the sacred precinct, right? So here we go. Chatzar ohel moed, shehashlamim halalu, and the reason is that even though this is a miluim, the ram of miluim is considered a sacrifice that's called shlamim. And there were various different types of sacrifices. They're mentioned and specified in the book of Leviticus. At the beginning of the book of Leviticus, there's an olah, which is a whole offering where essentially the entire animal is either burnt or parts that are not put on the altar are burnt off elsewhere, and the skin would go to the priests by way of paying. This is by way of payment of the priest for bringing the olah. But essentially, it was a whole offering. It doesn't mention, the Torah doesn't mention explicitly what the olah comes to do. According to tradition, the olah comes to atone for positive commandments that have been neglected. And then we have a something called a chatat, which is a sin offering, which is brought specifically, obviously, by way of atoning for a sin. A part of the chatat went onto the altar. Part of the chatat actually went to the priest. The priests actually had to consume part of the chatat, and then the rest of the animal was basically burned off, right? And then there was a shlamim. Shlamim was an offering that was essentially brought for thanksgiving, by way of expressing thanksgiving. And their part went on the altar, part went to the priest, specific parts, and part went to the family that brought the offering. So we have these kinds of things, and the miluim is considered a shlamim sacrifice. The most holy offering, they also have degrees of holiness. These are all things that are discussed in the book of Leviticus. An olah and a chatat are high level, first level holy offerings. A shlamim, partially because it's consumed, part of it's consumed by the family, by non-priests, is considered a secondary level of holiness. There are practical ramifications to these things with regards to how long they can be eaten for and things like that, the time you have to eat them. And so the holier an offering is, the less of an opportunity generally you have to consume it and to take care of it. Whereas with the shlamim, generally you have a little longer in which to consume it. And this miluim, certainly it's also going to be consumed, you're going to see in the next verse, is partially consumed by Aaron and his sons. So it's a shlamim, in this case, a shlamim sacrifice at this point, but nevertheless, it still has to be cooked in this precinct of the Mishkan. And that's what Rashi's telling us, that this particular shlamim was considered Kodesh, Kodashim. Here it is, Kodshei Kodashim. Going on. V'achal Aharon uvanav, and Aaron and his sons shall consume et b'sar ha'ayil, the flesh of the ram, v'et halechem asher basal. So this refers now to bread. Generally, it was matzahs, unleavened bread, in the basket. So this is stuff that was mentioned earlier on, material mentioned earlier on, as to what accompanied the offerings. It wasn't just the offering itself. The offering was accompanied by a mincha, by a meal offering, so bread, and by oil, and also with wine. There were libations that went along with it. And the fact that it represented, of course, now you can see having a meal, right? To sitting down in a meal. And I think, in reflecting on that, you may have some thoughts about this, is that a meal is a very intimate experience in which you share something with someone else. I learned how to cook very late in life, and I would have people over for dinner, especially, of course, Shabbat. And I discovered a number of things when I started to cook. And one is that when you share a meal and people are consuming what you are producing, there's a high level of trust and a certain degree of intimacy in the fact that people are ingesting what you are producing. And so there's really great significance to that. There's also the whole idea of feeding, what goes into feeding human beings. And if you've ever looked into the actual process of food, of the making of food, etc., and the number of stages and steps and individuals that are involved in all of that process It is absolutely astounding. And there's a wonderful statement that says just making sure that people have enough food to eat every day is difficult, of course, in quotation marks, for God as the parting of the Red Sea. So understanding to some extent the miraculous nature of the fact that we're able to feed ourselves. So, at any rate, Aaron and his sons shall eat the flesh of the meat of the ram and the bread that is in the basket. Petach Ohel Moed. So it was significant as to where they were to eat it, right? Every detail was taken into account. If you've actually seen the ritual of the tomb of the unknown soldier in Washington at Arlington Cemetery, and if you've looked into what's involved there, every single element of that particular ceremony is detailed. And in fact, it is in some ways, it parallels its own sort of priesthood, the kinds of discipline that the people who are allowed to participate in that ceremony is involved there, and then of course the number of steps they take when they march, how often they do it per minute, every detail is outlined. So looking attention to detail, of course, I believe, is one of the ways in which we try to demonstrate how much we care and how much we love a certain thing, right? How much attention to detail. So let's go here. Let's go on. So take a look at Rashi for this. Let's see. Yeah. Petach Ohel Moed. So Rashi has a need to explain what do we mean by the entrance of the tent of meeting, right? So it doesn't mean the outer entrance where the courtyard, the curtains of the courtyard were, but it refers to the actual courtyard itself. And he says, Kol hachatzar, the entire courtyard, karuiche. That's what it's referred to. So that whole area that's in essentially around or in front of the tent of meeting within that courtyard area is known as Petach Ohel Moed, the opening or the entrance to the tent of meeting. So, v'achlu otam asher chupar bahem. The syntax here is not simple here, but the Torah is trying to give us some details as to why they consume this particular ram. At any rate, v'achlu otam asher kupar bahem. So, they shall eat those. This is the way I'm understanding it. Those who gained atonement through this. Lemale, so there is an atonement nature to this particular process, because the ram of ordination wasn't the only offering that was brought, right? But Aaron and his sons also had to gain a level of atonement in order to attain the holiness required to be able to serve as priests. So Lemale et yadam, in order to ordain them, lekadesh otam, and to sanctify them. Vizar, and a stranger, meaning a non-priest, lo yuchal, he's not permitted to eat this. Ki kodesh, or I think this is, let me think. It could be, or ki kadoshem. There's a vowel missing here. Again, the print in this book isn't always clear. So I am guessing here, but I believe it would be Kadoshem. Lauren, I think you have a text, don't you, that's better printed? Do you have anything different there? Okay. All right. So a stranger shall not eat it, for they are sanctified. And I believe we are referring here to either, we could be referring to, of course, Aaron and his sons, or we could be referring possibly to the food that they're eating.
So did you want the English or the
No,
Hebrew?
the Hebrew. I wanted to make sure I was saying that it was kadosh.
It says Ki Kodesh.
Okay, it is kodesh. All right, thank you. I wasn't sure. Okay, that does make more sense actually. Thank you. V'achlu otam, right? They shall eat that, right? Who Aaron Uvanav, right? The otam is referring to Aaron and his sons. Lefi shehem ba'alehem. And Rashi gives an interesting additional level of insight into here. He says, because they are the owners of the sacrifice. So with a shlamim offering, the people who actually brought the sacrifice, who had to purchase it and bring it, were the ones who were permitted to eat it. So Rashi's giving us another reason why they're allowed to and commanded to eat this sacrifice. They had to, Aaron and his sons would have had to bring this ram from their own possessions, right, or with their own money or whatever. Asher kupar bahem, through whom atonement was made. Lahem, okay, what do it mean? So it means kol zarut v'ta'ava, right? So again, this is challenging to me, okay? But ta'uv, right? So I believe we're talking about here about Aaron and his sons. In other words, the Aaron and his sons have been atoned, the atonement has been made for Zarut. Zar, as I said, means just stranger. It can also mean something that is not holy or uh, unusual, but in a negative kind of sense. And so they are no longer considered non-Kohen. And ta'uv means objectionable. It also means, quite honestly, disgusting. So, in other words, recognizing that human beings can behave in weird and disgusting kinds of ways, there's this consciousness of a need to be able to leave that and try and cleanse oneself. That's the way it would be understood spiritually, and that's why they're in a position to eat sacrifices. Now, I mentioned with the shlamim that the people who brought the shlamim, the family, were permitted to eat of it. There were other concerns as well. One was that they were in a state of purity, and so again, the book of Leviticus that deals essentially with this whole situation and system talks about degrees and levels of impurity, and again, if something, the higher level of sanctity an object had, the more sensitive it would become to any kind of impurity. So Aaron and his sons had to be cleansed of any impurity in order for them to consume this particular offering. Okay. Lemale et yadam. So literally it means, of course, to fill their hands. But what it does essentially mean is to ordain them. In other words, to put them into a situation where they now can function as priests. Be'el v'lechem halalu. In other words, this ram and this bread, these items, are part of the process by which the ordination is completed. L'kadeshotam, to sanctify them. She'al yedei hamiluim halalu, that is to say, by means of these particular miluim, that's a reference to these kinds of offerings, right? Nit mal'u yedehem, they have satisfied, right? You could say, have satisfied the requirements. They need kachu lakuna, and now they are sanctified and ready to serve as priests to the priesthood. Ki kodesh hem, right? For they are sanctified. Kodshe kodashim, and I think here he is saying, referring that he's saying that it refers to the offerings. That is the milu, that's the ram and the bread, right? Kodshe kodashim, the most holy. Umikan lamadnu, unless we are in fact, he's saying it refers to Aaron and his sons. Let's leave that as a question just for a moment and see if Rashi will clarify that. He says, Mikan lamanu, from this we can learn, azhara, a warning, lazar, to a non-priest, right? A stranger, but a non-priest in this context, ha'ochel kodshe kodashim, who eats the most holy sacrifices, right? So I think I'm back to saying that it's referring to the ram and the bread, right? That's what it's talking about. Shinatan hamikra, because scripture gives a reason. Tam ladavar. That is, tam would be, literally it means a taste, but it means a reason for the matter. Mishum de kadosh haim, I'm going to say. that they are sanctified. So again, though, now I'm back to saying, wow, what is it referring to? Lauren, do you have any clarification there? Because to me, this is ambiguous.
Well, it says the category for they are holy in the category of superior holiness. From here we learn the prohibition for a non-priest to eat sacrificial meat of the superior category of holiness. The scripture here gives the reason why a layman may not eat them because they are holy.
Okay, so I'm pretty sure that the translation is suggesting that it's referring to the sacrifices and not to Aaron and his sons.
Yeah, because it says, well, here at least this version says they may not eat them because they are holy.
Hmm.
Aaron and his sons they may not eat because they are people.
Well, obviously, right. But again, yes, indeed. Uh, Even so, it still could refer to the fact that why Aaron and his sons can eat of these is because they are most holy. That's where I was getting some ambiguity here. Okay, let's try a little bit more. Okay.
Rabbi,
Yes, please.
uh, can you say a little bit more, with the exception of Aaron and his sons, can you say a little bit more about the demography of the audience uh, for for this for these kinds of descriptive kinds of of direction? And the background of my question is, uh, are people used, are the people, what brings the people to this sort of discussion in the first place?
Now, when you say people, are you talking about the people back then, or are you talking about the people now, or the
Back, back,
people who?
back then for sure.
Okay, all right. So it's a really wonderful, wonderful question because what it is suggesting is that you don't have to be actively participating in order to benefit, and gain the benefit of what's going on by the priests in this particular case, these particular people. But that in understanding and being knowledgeable in what they are doing, you, in a sense, can participate. Not directly, and I'm sorry because I'm blocking on the word that describes it when you do something and you're not the one who actually is doing it.
Vicarious.
Yeah, that's the word. Thank you, Lauren. Yes. That nevertheless, vicariously, by observing and by learning about these sorts of things, there is a level of a very high level, I would say, of significance to what you're doing. And even sort of the whole idea of knowing your place and accepting the fact that this isn't democratic and that life itself isn't democratic in the sense that everybody gets everything, right? You have knowing your role and knowing the specific, being able to accomplish what your particular mission is in fact a very sacred task. So I don't know if I'm answering your question well enough, Larry, but that's why it would be important. And by the way, it's this particular factor, this particular piece of information that would allow the Jewish people to exist after the temple was destroyed. To know the level of symbolism involved in what these are about, these various sacrifices. To some extent, I can tell you that there are basically three types of animals that are used. The first category is a bull, right, or a cow. That represents Abraham. And the ram represents Isaac, and the sheep or goats, well, the sheep represent Jacob, and the goats, it depends. If it's a goat of a sin offering, it represents the goat that the brothers brought to Jacob to show him that Joseph was dead. And learning and understanding the deeper significance of all these kinds of things sort of really brings it into into a way in which we no longer have to look down at these things as if somehow they're, primitive or, base or something like that, and realizing that they actually contain very, very deep ideas in terms of what it is to be a human being, and a mortal human being at that. So I'm very happy to take a follow-up question, Larry, if I'm not, if that raises other issues for you.
The additional question, I guess, is uh, uh, the people uh, who are not Aaron and his mishpacha.
Yes.
Uh, they obviously had other, just as us common folk do. They have other things going on in their life, and what led them to take the time, I guess, to ponder to to ponder the question, how does any of this apply to me, who I'm having to have to make a living, I have to support my family, and so forth.
So there are a couple of ideas, thoughts that I have. One is simply saying that this doesn't take 24/7, right? It takes a certain amount of time, just like, we live in a society, at least our society is highly involved in entertainment, right? I mean, it's a very entertainment directed society. And part of the idea of entertainment is that when you're watching this going on, emotionally, you become very involved. And there's that awareness that we actually are much more, could I use the term symbiotic, than
Mhm.
we realize, perhaps. Because again, it seems to me that our society tends to be somewhat narcissistic on a conscious level. But the truth is that subconsciously, we are far more um, engaged emotionally, etc., and spiritually in terms of our leaders and things like that, and one another, our families, people that we have some emotional ties to. Uh, so I know that in some senses you're saying to me, well, when did they have the time to do this? Well, look, I know back then, of course, the major responsibility, society was divided up much more in terms of the women had their role and their world, you might say, and men had their role and their world. And it seemed like it was much more, clearly divided as opposed to nowadays. Um, but at any rate, that was the understanding in terms of society back then. It didn't mean that women had no role. It didn't mean that women weren't also emotionally involved as women in terms of what their husbands were doing, or that the husbands weren't, that the men weren't also emotionally involved in what the women were having to achieve too. Um, but traditionally in Jewish society, women have the primary role in child rearing. Not that men don't have any, they do, absolutely. But like I said, it gets into quite, you know, detailed and complicated issues in terms of how society was basically set up back then. Again, if that's an answer to your question.
Yeah, it is. It's very helpful.
But I think women also had a place. I mean, it's so interesting that one of the main courtyards of the temple was known as the women's court. So it wasn't that women were excluded, but the point is that everybody's excluded on some level or another, right? If you're a non-priest, you're excluded. If you're a non-Levite, you're excluded, right? If you're an Israelite, you have your own particular, you know, issues that you have to deal with and responsibilities. So it's obviously a deep and broad topic, and I'm not here to pass judgment. At least I hope I'm not. So. Yeah, I mean, in some ways, the fact that Aaron and his sons were being inaugurated into the priesthood, in a way, the entire Jewish people were being inaugurated into the priesthood. That's the connection. So thank you, because your question brought out that particular issue. Thanks a lot. Okay. So I'm going to stop the recording with this. Wait a moment.